If you grew up watching Christian television any time in the last 30 years, you know the face of Joni Lamb. Together with her husband Marcus, she built Daystar, a multi-million-dollar religious broadcasting empire that reached into billions of homes across the globe. To the millions of faithful viewers who tuned in every single day, the Lamb family was the ultimate symbol of public faith and divine success. They were wealthy, they were powerful, and above all, they projected an image of a picture-perfect family. But a television screen only shows you what the producer wants you to see. Beyond the bright studio lights and far away from the cameras, there was another story. One of scandal, a broken family, and unanswered questions. This is the story of Joni Lamb. Joni Lamb was born on July 19, 1960, in Colleyville, Texas, and grew up in Greenville, South Carolina. She was raised in a church-going family, and they were members of the Tremont Avenue Church of God, a congregation where faith wasn't just something you wore on Sunday. It was the air you breathed. It was there, at a revival meeting, that a young evangelist from Georgia walked through the church doors and changed the course of her life. His name was Marcus Lamb. He had come to Tremont Avenue to lead a revival service, and among the people sitting in the congregation was Joni. Joni was immediately drawn to Marcus's confidence and commanding presence at the pulpit. Marcus also took notice of Joni. He admired her beauty, her warmth, and the quiet confidence she carried. After the revival, the two began talking more often, growing closer with every conversation. What started as a simple introduction inside a church slowly turned into something deeper. Months later, Marcus and Joni officially began dating. They were married 2 years later, on August 6, 1982. In the early days of their marriage, they were simply traveling evangelists. They drove across the country preaching wherever they were invited, often struggling to make ends meet. But everything changed during a trip to Israel less than a year into their marriage. Marcus claimed that while they were there, God spoke to him directly and told him to build a television station. Believing it was a divine calling, he and Joni invested what little savings they had into the idea. According to Joni, they were so poor that they had to dig a broadcast transmitter out of a dumpster just to get started. In 1985, that dumpster transmitter became a television station. It was called WMCF-TV, broadcasting out of Montgomery, Alabama, under the nickname 45 Alive. Marcus was 28. Joni was 25. It was the first Christian television station in the state of Alabama. Not long after it launched, their first child was born, a boy named Jonathan. In 1990, their daughter Rachel was born, and that same year the Lambs sold WMCF-TV to the Trinity Broadcasting Network, the largest Christian TV network in the world, and moved to the heart of megachurch country, Dallas, Texas. They bought a defunct local channel, KMPX-TV29, and began broadcasting. Its first live broadcast was of T.D. Jakes' New Year's Eve service at the Potter's House in 1992. The same year their third and final child, Rebecca, was born. By this time, what had started as a small, faith-driven broadcasting effort had grown far beyond anything Marcus or Joni could have imagined. TV29 was now reportedly reaching millions of viewers across multiple regions, and the momentum kept building. On New Year's Day in 1998, they made a major move. They officially launched the Daystar television network. The name Daystar was chosen from a Bible verse in 2 Peter 1 verse 19, which speaks of a day star rising in believers' hearts, symbolizing light breaking through darkness. As the network expanded, it began hosting a growing lineup of well-known pastors who paid for broadcasting time. Marcus remained part of the on-air lineup, while Joni eventually launched her own program. A women's show originally called Taking a Break with Joni, later shortened to simply Joni, and then renamed to Joni Table Talk. In the early years, however, the audience was still small. Some recordings had very few attendees, and staff members were sometimes asked to sit in as the studio audience just to fill the room. But that would not last. By 2003, Daystar had moved into a 90,000-square-foot facility with 17 advanced studios, allowing for more polished productions and expanded programming. That same period also saw rising interest from prominent church leaders. A Houston-based pastor named Joel Osteen, whose church was growing rapidly, launched his televised program on the network. Other major names, including Jesse Duplantis, Joyce Meyer, and Hillsong Church, also joined the lineup. Daystar continued to expand internationally. With Marcus's connections to Israel, the network was reportedly granted a license in 2006 to broadcast in the country, becoming the first Christian television network of its kind there. Over time, under the Lambs' leadership, Daystar grew from a handful of stations into a global presence carried across major cable and satellite providers around the world. Even in its early success, Daystar was not without critics. In 2009, Marcus Lamb stood before a live audience in Australia and boasted about the network's charitable giving, claiming that in 5 years, Daystar had written $30 million in donation checks to churches, missions, hurricane relief, and tsunami aid. NPR went and looked at the financial statements. What they found told a very different story. Over 6 years of Daystar's records, the network had given away not $30 million, but $9.7 million in charitable contributions. That amounted to just 5% of their donor revenue. According to the same NPR investigation, Daystar spent over $572,000 of donors' money on things like sponsoring a Christian NASCAR driver. They also gave a $2.3 million loan to one of Marcus's former assistant and golfing friend to help start a church, and spent nearly $100,000 buying copies of Joni's autobiography from retail bookstores to help drive up her sales numbers and push it onto a bestseller list. Daystar responded that those books had been given away as gifts to donors. Because Daystar was a television network that broadcasted ministry, the IRS allowed them to be classified as a church. This meant their operations were entirely tax-exempt. Critics of televangelism began to question the family's extreme wealth. The Lambs lived in megamansions. Their children attended expensive private schools. Marcus drove a Maserati. They even owned a private jet, which they used for family vacations that were written off as ministry retreats. Yet for years, their loyal viewers didn't care. They continued to send in donations, trusting the family's flawless public image. But employees who had worked closely with the Lambs were beginning to build a very different picture of what life at Daystar actually looked like. Marcus and Joni were treated like royalty in the halls of Daystar. Employees were excited simply to be acknowledged by them. What the Lambs wanted, the Lambs got. Inside Daystar, employees worked under strict instructions. The Lamb family photos were to be retouched. Joni was to be made thinner. They were all to appear younger. Joni specifically refused to put gas in her own car or touch her gas tank. A member of Daystar's security team filled it up and cleaned her vehicle, on donor money. When she left the building in summer, someone had to have the car running with the AC on in advance, so it would be cool by the time she got in. Former executive assistant Lisa Anderson, who worked for Joni from 2007 to 2011, described a working environment where she was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays. One Thanksgiving, while eating dinner with her family, she received a call from Joni asking her to go pick up a cake from a bakery and leave it on the kitchen counter of the Lamb mansion. Lisa drove to the house to find the family sitting in the dining room, having their Thanksgiving meal. She left the cake on the counter without a word and drove back to her own family dinner. Lisa also described having to handle Joni's medical stool samples, bagging them in biohazard bags and mailing them off for testing, as part of her regular job duties. Former art director Morgan Ferris, who worked in Daystar's marketing department, painted an equally troubling picture, particularly around Rachel Lamb, Joni and Marcus's second child, who came in as a college student, demanding that the entire department drop whatever they were working on to accommodate her personal projects. When Rachel's behavior was reported to Joni, the reporting employee was told she was being judgmental and to move on. Daystar wasn't just a ministry. It was a carefully controlled family affair. They were the royal family of Christian television, offering their viewers a front-row seat to a life that seemed perfectly blessed. Then, in 2010, the most personal controversy of all erupted, not in the press, but on the air. Marcus Lamb sat before his own cameras and admitted to his congregation, and to the world, that he had engaged in an extramarital affair. The couple claimed they were going public because they were the victims of an extortion plot. They told their viewers that 3 people were demanding $7.5 million to keep the affair quiet, and that they refused to use God's money to pay off blackmailers. Joni spoke about her heartbreak, but said she chose to forgive Marcus and fight for her marriage. The audience poured out their support. But behind the scenes, the story was very different. The supposed extortionists were actually 3 former Daystar employees who were filing a lawsuit against the network. The affair hadn't just been a brief mistake. It was a 7-year relationship with Daystar's vice president of programming, Janice Smith. The lawsuit alleged that Marcus used company funds during the affair, and that the workplace had become a toxic environment of cover-ups and secrets. The IT department had found emails between them containing explicit statements. One email from Marcus read, "I cannot wait to make you the next Mrs. Lamb." And it wasn't personal funds that had been used to conduct and conceal the relationship. It was Daystar money. Upon Janice Smith's departure from the company, she was reportedly paid significant sums of money to keep the affair a secret. To control the damage, Marcus and Joni went on the Dr. Phil show. They presented a united front, claiming they had kept the affair secret to protect their young children and to heal privately. They framed the story as a victory of faith over temptation. The strategy worked. The lawsuits were eventually dropped, and their audience forgave them. Only 2 months after the first lawsuit, they were sued again by another employee who claimed Joni's father, Bill Trammell, who also worked at Daystar, had sexually harassed her by touching her inappropriately during what he called quiet time. The lawsuit was filed in Dallas and alleged that Bill created a hostile work environment. Some of the documents from the lawsuit stated that during quiet time, Mr. Trammell would make the plaintiff hug him tightly for extended periods of time, would often put his hands very close to her breasts or buttocks during these extended touchings, and on more than 2 occasions told the plaintiff to sit on his lap. Marcus and Joni called the claims outrageous and denied anything had ever happened. Daystar survived the scandal. A year after graduating from Oral Roberts University, their son Jonathan became director of operations at Daystar. He met and fell in love with a woman named Suzy, who had studied divinity at Christ for the Nation's Bible College and Business at Dallas Baptist University. After Jonathan and Suzy married, the couple began hosting a show on Daystar called The Green Room. Marcus and Joni were overjoyed at their union. In 2011, after Jonathan became Daystar's vice president, Joni began grooming Suzy to become the Daystar matriarch. It was no secret that Jonathan would one day take over Marcus's role as president, and Joni wanted to teach Suzy the ins and outs of the network while making sure her other children didn't grow jealous. In the middle of workdays, she would tell employees and family members she was going to get her nails done. But really, she was taking Suzy to lunch and passing on insider information. At first it seemed like innocent mother and daughter-in-law bonding. But eventually Joni became more and more controlling of Suzy, even telling her who she could and couldn't be friends with. Around 2015, Joni's nephew and his wife began working for Daystar. He was excited to be around his cousins Jonathan, Rachel, and Rebecca. The couple genuinely believed they had been blessed with the opportunity. The job also came with perks, including free adjustments from Daystar's in-house chiropractor. There was just one problem: the chiropractor was unlicensed. He had lost his license because of an alleged assault on a minor. Whether Marcus and Joni knew about his history is unclear, but Joni told the nephew that it was company policy for another staff member to always be present whenever a woman was being adjusted. Not knowing the man's background, the nephew thought nothing of it and made sure he was always present during his wife's sessions. At first, everything seemed normal. But eventually the chiropractor began making comments that made the nephew uncomfortable, particularly remarks about his wife's body during her adjustments. The discomfort escalated when the chiropractor texted him one day suggesting the 3 of them go out to dinner, and then come back to his pool for a night swim afterward. The nephew brought his concerns to Joni, who did nothing. The unlicensed chiropractor was allowed to stay at Daystar, a decision that would lead to disastrous consequences. In January of 2017, Suzy went in for an adjustment. He had been giving her adjustments for a couple of years without incident, but on that day Suzy noticed something was off. She suspected he may have been drunk. When her coworker stepped out to use the bathroom, leaving Suzy alone with him for around 5 minutes, the chiropractor violently essayed her. As soon as she got away, she called Jonathan to tell him what had happened. Jonathan was furious and immediately called his parents. Marcus and Joni were out of town, but Marcus told his son not to say a word and that he would handle it when they returned. Several days later, Suzy said Joni told her that Marcus had paid the chiropractor off and that he would not harm her again. She then told Suzy, "We need to protect Daystar, and I want to protect you, so don't say a word about this to anyone." Daystar spent the next decade growing even larger, becoming the 2nd largest Christian television network in the world. But in 2020, a completely different type of crisis arrived with the COVID-19 pandemic. Marcus used his platform to speak out against vaccines and mandates. The network heavily promoted alternative treatments, framing the global health crisis as a spiritual battle. In July of 2020, the network spent an hour of airtime complaining about censorship around the pandemic. The Lambs pushed unproven vitamins and pseudoscience on their website, and Daystar called vaccines the most dangerous thing children face. Not long after, the Lambs applied for a government PPP loan through Daystar, which they stated would be used to pay their employees throughout the pandemic. Daystar received $3.9 million in taxpayer funds, and 2 weeks later, they purchased a private jet. The luxury aircraft was a 1997 Gulfstream that held 14 passengers. The Lambs promptly used it to take a family vacation to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which they posted about joyously across their social media accounts. 2 months after that, in October, Marcus, Joni, and their friends flew on Daystar's private jet to Naples, Florida, where they played golf and spent 8 days on vacation. It was on that 2020 summer vacation that a troubling incident first came to light. A male family member, referred to by Jonathan and Suzy only as Pete, approached Suzy and told her that her 4-year-old daughter had accidentally walked in on him in the bathroom and seen him in full frontal nudity. Suzy found it strange but was relieved he told her, and since her daughter seemed fine, she moved on. But by December of 2020, her her daughter was finally able to tell Suzy that she had been horribly assaulted by a man. She didn't say who it was and only described a few physical features. At first, Suzy believed it to be someone at her daughter's school, until she called the school and was told they didn't employ any men. Suzy reported the incident to Joni. Rather than telling her to call the police, Joni told her to bring the child to her. Suzy did as she was instructed, and Joni took the little girl into a room alone. After that conversation, the child completely stopped speaking about the incident. No matter what Jonathan and Suzy tried, they could no longer get their daughter to open up. Jonathan and Suzy secretly reported the assault to the police, but because their daughter would no longer speak about it after her meeting with Joni, the police closed the case. As time went on, Jonathan and Suzy began to suspect the perpetrator was Pete. 8 months after their daughter first disclosed the assault, it was August of 2021, and the entire Lamb family was on another vacation at Miramar Beach, Florida, staying in a 3-story beach house. Their daughter, now 5 years old, wanted to swim in the pool. Suzy told her to go upstairs to her room and get her swimsuit on. Pete, who had been in the room holding his own baby, heard the exchange and immediately followed the little girl upstairs. Suzy said his eyes went black, like he was in a trance. Alarmed, she yelled to Jonathan to go upstairs immediately and check on their daughter. She sent Jonathan specifically because she knew that if she was the one to raise the alarm, she would not be believed the way Jonathan would. She feared she would be gaslit, and she would later find out she was right. Jonathan raced upstairs and found Pete in the room with their daughter, who was completely naked. Having suspected Pete for some time, Jonathan screamed at him. Pete immediately began stuttering and apologizing. Jonathan said it was as if he had been caught red-handed. Jonathan and Suzy marched downstairs to confront Marcus and Joni. To their horror, Marcus and Joni immediately tried to justify Pete's behavior, saying he loved their daughter and probably just wanted to spend time with her. Suzy refused to back down, pointing out that none of that explained why he was in the room while their daughter was naked. Joni's response was to blame the child, saying it was the 5-year-old who had taken her own clothes off. Marcus then tried to relate to Pete, saying he knew what it felt like to be falsely accused. Eventually, Marcus and Joni brought both couples into their bedroom for a private meeting, where they insisted everyone repent to each other and pray together, and also asked Jonathan and Suzy to apologize to Pete. Jonathan and Suzy were prepared to go to the police. But 1 week later, Marcus called Jonathan and his brother-in-law into his office and told them they could breathe easy, because Pete had been forensically cleared by the police. He said they could all move forward in peace. But Marcus was lying, and Jonathan and Suzy would never be able to confront him about that lie, because only 3 months later, he was dead. In November 2021, Marcus contracted COVID-19. Despite having access to the best care available, including the alternative treatments Daystar had spent months promoting, he became severely ill. The tone of the Daystar broadcast shifted from confidence to desperation. Joni and Jonathan went on air, giving real-time updates on Marcus's failing oxygen levels and begging their millions of viewers to pray for a miracle. But the miracle never came. Marcus passed away on November 30th, 2021. After Marcus's death, Joni began a relationship with Doug Weiss, a controversial Christian counselor and self-proclaimed recovered sex addict who had been a regular on-air contributor at Daystar. Doug filed for divorce from his wife of over 30 years just 8 weeks after Marcus passed. 2 months after Doug's divorce was finalized, Joni purchased a building lot down the road from her home, with a permit to build a 9,700 square foot $4 million home for her and Doug to live in. Despite her children begging her not to, Joni eventually married Doug Weiss. The breaking point for the family came when Joni instructed Jonathan and Suzy to read a viewer comment on air praising her marriage to Doug. Because Jonathan and Suzy believed Doug's divorce lacked biblical grounds, and because Joni had once told Suzy that Doug's ex-wife Lisa was sobbing and begging him to come back, they refused to publicly endorse the marriage. That single act of defiance sent Joni into a rage. She called them into a meeting with Pastor Jimmy Evans, where both she and Jimmy bullied them for hours, demanding submission over 100 times. When Suzy held firm and said she could not go against her convictions, Joni fired her on the spot. Jimmy told Suzy bluntly that her job was simply to please the boss, and that if she couldn't read a nice comment about Doug, she had no place at Daystar. Jonathan refused to return to any on-air program without Suzy. Joni responded with 13 controlling stipulations he had to agree to, including deleting recordings of her and publicly endorsing her marriage to Doug. Jonathan refused to sign an NDA and was eventually fired. In the years that followed, the stress of running a global television empire while publicly battling her own children took a devastating toll on Joni. Once the energetic, radiant face of Daystar, she began making fewer public appearances, quietly retreating behind the gates of her Texas compound as her health declined. She never publicly explained why. Daystar never stopped broadcasting to billions of homes, preaching family values while the family behind it remained completely broken. The donations kept coming, the signal never dimmed, and the world kept watching, until there was nothing left to watch over. On May 7, 2026, Daystar announced that Joni Lamb had passed away. She had built something remarkable from nothing, a television network that reached billions and gave a platform to the Christian faith on a global scale. But the very values she preached, protection, truth, and family, were the ones she ultimately failed to uphold behind closed doors.